"You've made yourself my home," said the scarred Confederate soldier after the freed slave woman hid him from the vigilante mob. The first thing I remember from that night is the smell of tallow and dry corn husks, and the sound of her feet on the plank floor, quick, deliberate, like she'd already decided what to do before she opened that door. I hadn't asked her to open it. I was just trying not to die against the back of it. My name is Elias Creed. I was born in Caldwell County, North Carolina, in the year 1839. I am going to tell you something that happened to me in the autumn of 1867, in a place called Milo Creek, in the eastern territories of Kansas, when I was 28 years old and had already decided, more or less, that I was done. Not in a dramatic way. There wasn't enough left of me for drama. Just done. The way a fire goes out not because you pour water on it, because you let it run out of wood and don't bother to fetch more. I'll tell you how I got there, and then I'll tell you what happened. I'll try not to dress it up. It doesn't need it. I had been 3 years out of the war. That sounds like a long time. It wasn't. 3 years was enough to get a scar across my left cheek from jaw to ear. That came at Petersburg. Not from a blade, but from a splinter, when a shell hit the wall beside me, and enough to walk the 1,500 miles home to Caldwell County and find that home was a chimney stack, and a root cellar, and a rusted hasp hanging off a wooden door that led to nothing. My father had died of flux in '64. My mother had gone to live with her sister in Tennessee while I was still in the field, and by the time I got to Caldwell County, she'd been in the ground 6 months. Her sister sent me a letter through a neighbor. It arrived 2 weeks after I did. I stood in that root cellar for a while. I'm not sure how long. Long enough for the light to change twice. Then I walked west. No plan. No destination. West is what men do when there's nothing east of them anymore. I hired on as a drover in Virginia, then a fence builder in Missouri. Then I did a stretch in Nebraska breaking sod for a land company that paid in scrip redeemable only at their own commissary at prices they set the morning you tried to spend it. That's the kind of thing you learn to smell after a while. Quit that after 2 months, took my actual wages, which was $3.40 in coin and a sack of dried peas, and kept moving. By the time I got to Kansas, I'd been working and walking for 2.5 years, and I had the following. A Henry rifle I'd carried since '63, 72 rounds for it, a bedroll, a skinning knife, a canvas haversack with a broken shoulder strap I kept meaning to fix, $11 and some change, and the scar. The scar is worth describing, I suppose, because it mattered in what happened. It ran from the hinge of my left jaw, up across the cheekbone, and curved slightly toward the outer corner of my eye. The skin there had knit wrong. Too tight, pulled, with a raised seam that went pale when I was cold and red when I was angry. As the sawbones in Richmond told me, I was lucky it missed the eye. I didn't feel lucky, but I understood what he meant. It was not a scar a man could hide, or a person could politely ignore. It announced itself. It shaped how people looked at me before I'd spoken a word. Sometimes with a flinch, sometimes with a kind of sideways wariness. They were trying to figure out what kind of man earns that. In Kansas in 1867, a scarred man who'd fought for the Confederacy and was traveling alone on foot was not a popular figure. Not among the freedmen's communities that had settled in the river bottoms, and not among the Union veterans in the towns, and not, it turned out, among the bands of men who called themselves regulators or committees, or various other names that dressed up what they were, which was gangs. You ran into all three of those if you worked the territory long enough. I had worked it for 4 months by the time I reached Milo Creek. Milo Creek was not a town so much as a tendency of buildings along a creek that occasionally flooded. There was a feed store that doubled as a post office, a blacksmith, a tavern with 2 rooms above it for rent, and a scatter of homesteads going out into the flats in every direction. It had a church that was also a schoolhouse and served, on Sunday evenings, as a meeting hall for whatever the men of the area felt needed meeting about. I arrived on a Wednesday. I'd been hired 2 weeks prior by a man named Garst to help him bring a small cattle herd down from a summer range. 15 head, nothing impressive, and we'd made Milo Creek by mid-afternoon. Garst paid me what he owed, which was honest wages, and he went on to wherever he was going, and I stayed, because one of the cattle had stepped on my right foot 3 days out, and I was walking with a limp that suggested something was cracked in there. and I didn't think I could make the next settlement before dark. I got a room above the tavern, ate a meal, salt pork and boiled potatoes, unremarkable, and I went to bed. What woke me up I didn't understand at first. A low sound, not close, carrying. I lay still and listened and worked it out to be voices. A lot of them. Talking low the way men talk, when they've gotten themselves into a collective mood and are enjoying the weight of it. I got up and went to the window. Below and down the street, maybe 150 yards, there were torches, 6, 7, 8 of them. A loose cluster moving slowly. Men on horseback, mostly. 2 or 3 on foot. I knew what that was. I'd seen it twice before in the territory, and once in Missouri. I didn't know who they were after, but I knew the shape of it. I watched from the window until they moved past the tavern and out toward the south edge of the settlement, then I went back to bed. I didn't sleep well after that. Not because of the torches. I'd learned to sleep through worse. But because the cattle had hit me harder than I'd admitted to Garst, and the foot was throbbing, and the straw mattress had a seam in the wrong place. And I kept thinking about the dried peas in my haversack, and whether I could get someone in the morning to cook them. That is the honest texture of that night, before things changed. The foot hurting, the peas, a straw seam. Some point before first light, I heard horses again. Faster this time, coming back north. Voices is louder. Something had gone wrong for them. Not found or scattered or warned off. And they were angry about it. The kind of angry that needs somewhere to land. The door to the tavern below hit the wall when they came in. I heard it from upstairs. Then shouting. Then a crash. Then the tavern keeper's voice going high and frightened. I sat up. Got my boots on. The right one hurt. I pulled it loose again and worked it on slowly. And took up the Henry and stood at the top of the stairs and listened. They were asking about someone. A woman, from what I could piece together. A colored woman who lived south of the settlement on a piece of land she'd taken up after the war. They'd gone to her place and she wasn't there. Or wasn't answering. Or they'd burned something. Couldn't be sure. And now they wanted to know if anyone had seen her. The tavern keeper was saying he didn't know anything about any woman, which was probably true, and was also what a man says when he's frightened enough to be honest. I heard one of them say she'd given shelter to a Union agitator. I heard another one say she had no business owning that land and everyone in the county knew it. I heard a third one say something I won't repeat here. Then they left. Horses is on dirt, fading south again. I stood at the top of those stairs for a minute with the Henry and the bad foot, and then I went back into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. Here is what I thought. It was not my business. I didn't know the woman. I didn't know what she's actually done or not done, or who the agitator was or wasn't. I was a man passing through, with a cracked foot and $11 and a haversack. And I had enough trouble walking to the next settlement without taking on other people's difficulties. That's what I thought. What I did was go back to the window and watch the torches move south again. Feel something in my chest that I recognized from the war. Not fear exactly. The particular discomfort of knowing you're about to do something that you'd rather not do, but that you're going to do. Anyway, because of who you are, which is not always a comfortable thing to know about yourself. I put the Henry over my shoulder and went downstairs. The tavern keeper looked at me like I was about to rob him. I told him I wasn't. I asked him if he knew where the colored woman lived. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, South Fork of the creek, half a mile, she has a tobacco barn you can see from the trail. And then he went back to wiping down the bar with a rag. And I understood that to mean he'd said everything he intended to say. I went south. My foot was bad enough that I cut a length of fence rail from a stack by the road and used it as a walking staff, which helped somewhat. The night was cold, proper October cold, with a rim of frost on the creek grass that crunched under my boots. No moon to speak of. Went by the stars, and by the sound of the water, and I found the tobacco barn about where he'd said, dark square against the lighter dark of the sky. The house was behind it, small, sod walls, plank roof. One window with a shutter latched from the inside. There was a kitchen garden off to the right, still holding some late greens that hadn't gone to frost yet, and a small corral with no animals in it. I didn't see any light inside. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I knocked again and said, Lo, I'm not with those men. I just want to know you're all right. Still nothing. Thought about it. Then I said, I don't know your name. I heard them asking about you in the tavern, and I came down to see if you needed anything. My name's Elias Creed. I'm nobody. I'll go if you want me to go. A long quiet. Long enough that I started to think either she wasn't there or she'd decided I was lying and was waiting me out. Then the shutter moved. Not much, an inch maybe. And I could feel her looking through the gap, though I couldn't see her eye. She said, "You walk with a limp," I said. "Cattle stepped on my foot," she said. "What were you doing with cattle?" I said. "Driving them." Another long quiet, she said. "You sound Southern," I said. "Carolina." She said, "You fight?" I said, "Did." She said, "Which side?" And I thought about lying and decided against it, I said. "Confederate." The shutter closed. I heard the latch move. I thought the conversation was over. Then the door opened. Her name was Della Marsh. She told me that later. That night she didn't tell me anything at first. She just looked at me in the crack of the doorway, holding a small lamp, face us, and her face was the kind of still that people use when they're deciding something important. And they've learned not to let what they're thinking show too soon. She was somewhere in her late 20s. Tall, nearly as tall as I was, with strong hands and dark eyes that caught the lamplight and held it. She wore a work dress that had been mended in 3 or 4 places I could see, and her hair was wrapped close to her head with a length of cotton cloth. She had been running, or had been ready to run. There was dirt on her skirt hem that hadn't been there long. One of her bootlaces was only half tied. She looked at my face for a moment, the scar, the way everyone looks at the scar. And then she looked at my eyes, she said. "You carry that rifle loose," I said. "I'm not here to use it," she said. "Men with rifles who aren't here to use them usually are." I said, "I heard them in the tavern I just came to see." She stood there looking at me. The lamp made her shadow go long across the dirt behind her. Then she said, "There are 8 of them. They'll come back before morning." I said, "I know," she said. "You can't stop 8 men," I said. "Maybe not. But I can make them think twice about how much trouble they want." She kept looking at me. Then she stepped back from the door. She didn't say come in, she just stepped back. I came in. The inside of her house was very clean. That's what I remember first. Not the smallness of it, not the rough walls, but the cleanness. The floor was swept. 2 tin plates on a shelf above the small iron stove, exactly level with each other. A Bible on a wooden crate that served as a table, closed and squared to the edge. A quilt on the single bed in the corner, folded back with precision. She had built something in here that she was taking care of. That meant something to me. Though, I couldn't have told you exactly what at the time. She had corn pone on the stove. It wasn't meant for me, but she cut a piece off and set it on one of those tin plates, and put it on the crate, and then went back to doing whatever she had been doing before I knocked, which was taking things down from a high shelf and wrapping them in cloth. I ate the corn pone, standing up because there was nowhere to sit except the bed, and I wasn't about to sit on her bed without being asked. It was very good. She'd used lard and salt, and there was a sharpness to it I didn't recognize. Some herb she'd put in. I asked her where she planned to go. She said she had a cousin in a settlement 12 miles east. She'd been waiting to see if they'd come back, or if morning would make it safe to move. I asked her what they wanted her for. She set down what she was wrapping and turned around and looked at me. She said, "A man came through here 2 weeks ago, union man, organizing. I gave him a meal and a place to sleep one night and he moved on. That's all I did. And somebody saw and told those men, and now they say I'm an instigator." I said, "And the land." She said, "And the land." She didn't say anything else about the land, but the way she said those 3 words covered a lot of ground. I said, "You have papers on it?" She said, "I have papers on it." I said, "Where are they?" She pulled back a corner of the quilt on the bed and took out a leather folder tied with cord. She held it up briefly, then put it back under the quilt. I said, "That's the first place they'll look." She looked at me for a moment. Then she took the folder out again, untied the cord, and folded the papers carefully and put them inside her dress, against her skin. Practical, unsentimental. She tied the cord around the empty folder and put it back under the quilt. I said, "That's better," she said. "I didn't ask your advice," I said. "No, ma'am, that's true." She went back to wrapping things. They came back at about 3 in the morning. I heard the horses well before they reached the house, which gave me time to position myself. I'd put out the lamp and we were in the dark, and I was standing to the left of the door where the sod wall was thick and I'd braced my back against it. Della was not where I'd told her to be. I'd told her to get in the root cellar, which she had, which was good. What I hadn't anticipated was that she'd come back out of it and was standing at my right shoulder when the horses stopped in front of the house. I looked at her. She looked at me. She had a double-barreled fowling piece that I hadn't seen before, old, the stock repaired with wire, and she was holding it like she knew how it worked. I said, very low. "Get back in the cellar," she said, equally low. "This is my house." That's all either of us said about it, because there wasn't time for more. There were 8 of them. I'd been told 8, and there were 8. They spread out in a loose line in front of the house, and one of them, the one doing most of the talking, a heavy-set man with a beard who rode a gray horse, called out for her to come out. He said it in a reasonable tone of voice. It was the most frightening kind of tone in that situation. I opened the door, I said, "She's not home," and then I raised the Henry so it caught what little light there was, and I waited. The man on the gray horse said, "And who are you?" I said. "Nobody in particular. Just a man with a rifle who's been awake since midnight and is not in an excellent mood." One of the men in the back moved his horse left. I tracked it with the barrel. He stopped. The man on the gray said, "This is none of your affair." I rode past the tavern twice and woke me up. "That makes it my affair," he said. "Step aside, friend," I said. "I'm not your friend, and I'm not stepping aside." There was a long quiet. The horses shifted. A man coughed somewhere in the back of the group. The cold was getting into everything. I could feel it through the doorframe at my back, and my foot was beginning to go numb in the boot, which I almost welcomed because numb was better than what it had been. He said, "There are 8 of us," I said. "I can count. I've got 12 rounds in the Henry, and I can shoot faster than you can ride. The first 4 of those rounds are going into the 4 of you closest to me. So I'd think about where you're sitting before you make a decision." Quiet. Long enough to mean something. Then he said slowly, "This isn't finished," I said. "Most things aren't." They turned and rode north. Not fast. They didn't want to look like they were running, but they went. I stood in the doorway until the sound of the horses was gone, and then I stood there another full minute, listening to the silence come back. My foot had started hurting again, which meant sensation was returning, which was not the improvement I'd thought it would be. Behind me, Della Marsh said, "4 rounds. "You only 4 rounds to spare," I said. "I had 72. I just wanted them thinking about the math." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "That was a lie then," I said. "It was a negotiation." She made a sound that might have been almost a laugh. I didn't turn around to see. She would not let me leave that night. I offered to go twice. She had neighbors east of the creek who might take in, and I thought my presence was more likely to cause her trouble than to prevent it. But she said the foot was bad enough that I'd slow down, on the road, and be useless to her or anyone else. And she said it the way a person says a plain fact, not to wound and not to spare you. She was right. I sat down on the floor against the wall and tried not to make the foot worse, and she built the fire back up and put a pot on and made something with dried beans and a piece of salt meat that I later understood was very nearly her last of both. She didn't talk much while she cooked. I didn't talk either. Shh. There's a kind of quiet that's comfortable, and a kind that's the absence of something that ought to be there. And what we had was neither. It was something else, something more watchful. 2 people figuring out who the other one was from the small evidence available. After a while she said, without turning from the stove, "Why'd you come?" I said, "I told you. I heard them in the tavern." She said, "That's what you did." I asked why. I thought about it. I said, "Shh." I don't know how to explain it except that it was wrong and I knew it was wrong, and I don't have enough left to be the kind of man who watches something wrong happen and goes back to sleep. She turned then and looked at me. The firelight was on the left side of her face, the side away from me, and her right side was in shadow. She said, "Confederate soldier." I said I was. "Enough, except a man trying to get somewhere." She said, "Where?" I said, "West, same as always." She said, "What's west?" I said, "I don't know. That's the point of going, I suppose." She turned back to the stove. My husband was killed in '63. He was trying to get to Union lines. 3 men caught him on the road and killed him for running, even though he wasn't anybody's property by then. The papers came through, but the men didn't get the news or didn't care about it. One. His name was Samuel. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "I'm sorry," she said. "You didn't kill him." I said, "No. But men who fought the same side as me might have." She considered that. She said, "Might have. That's an honest thing to say," I said. "I don't have the energy for the other kind." She brought 2 bowls over, set one beside me on the floor without making it seem like she was doing me a courtesy, and sat on the edge of the bed with the other one. We ate. The beans were good. She'd done something with a dried pepper, ground up fine, that gave the whole thing a low heat that built slowly and then eased. I said, "This is very good," she said. "I know." That was the first time I almost laughed. Before dawn, she bandaged my foot. I hadn't asked her to. She'd looked at it when I took the boot off. It was swollen across the top, and there were 2 toes that had gone a deep color and were not moving, the way toes ought to move. And she went to a box under the bed and got out a length of clean cloth and some kind of poultice that smelled of yarrow and something I couldn't identify. And she wrapped the foot without asking permission and without commenting on the state of it. Hands were very sure. Not rough. Exactly. Strong, with the sureness of someone who has learned to do things properly because there was no one else around to do them, and doing them badly would cost you. I watched her work. There's something about being tended to. I don't know how to say this exactly without it sounding like more than it was, which was just a woman doing a practical thing for a man who needed it. But I hadn't been tended to in a long time, since the war, or since before it. And there's a particular kind of loneliness that you don't notice, because it becomes the standard condition, and you don't realize how long you've been carrying it until someone does something simple and kind and it shifts something in your chest in a way. It's almost uncomfortable. I didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She wrapped the foot and tied it, and then she went to the stove and washed her hands. She said, "You need to stay off it for 3 days at minimum." Said, "I can't do that," she said. "You can't walk on it either. Those 2 things together leave you with the problem," I said. "I'll manage," she said. That's what men say when they mean they're going to make something worse. "And then be stubborn about it," I said. "I've been told that before," she said. "Did you listen?" I said. "Not always." She looked at me with that still expression she had. Then she said, "You can stay 3 days. After that you go. And you don't tell anyone you were here." I said. "I won't," she said. "I mean it about the 3 days. You're not doing anyone any good limping down that road." I said. "I understand." She said, "Good. There's a blanket in the chest. The floor is what it is." That was that. I stayed 3 days. Then 4, then 5. Not because of the foot, though the foot improved slowly and painfully, and was not road ready until nearly the end of the week. I stayed because there was work to be done that I could do, and she let me do it. The second morning, I fixed a hinge on the corral gate that had been hanging wrong. It took me an hour to find what I needed in her small woodpile and outbuilding. She was not a woman who threw things away, so she had the materials, just not organized in a way that was obvious. And then another half hour to do it right. She came out and looked at it and didn't say anything. She ran her hand along the top rail and tested the swing of the gate and nodded once. That afternoon, I dug out a section of the root cellar entrance that had been getting water in it from a break in the grade. Foot screamed at me the whole time. I did it on my knees with a small spade, crawling. Not because it was dignified, but because it was the only way to work without putting weight on the foot. She brought me water twice and didn't comment on my being on my knees in the mud. The third day, I replaced 2 of the roof planks that had gone soft. She had spare boards in the outbuilding, cut but never put up, and I had to guess at whether she wanted them up by how long they'd been sitting there. And I caulked the gap in the north wall of the house with a clay mixture she showed me how to make. She showed me without condescension, the way you'd show anyone something they hadn't done before. "Here, this is how the ratio works. You want it this thick. Let it set an hour before you go back over it." We talked while we worked. Not constantly. She was not a constant talker, and neither was I, but in the stretched out way that people talk when they're doing something with their hands, and conversation can go where it wants. She told me about the land. She'd taken it up in '65, when the government was processing the freedmen's land claims in the territory. She'd walked 3 weeks from Missouri to file the claim, carrying everything she had. The first winter she'd lived in a dugout. The tobacco barn was the first thing she built, because she needed a cash crop before she could afford to build the house. And she wanted to build the house right. She had built it right. Looking at it close, working on it, I could see that. The way the sod had been laid, the attention to the corners, the careful placement of the single window for morning light. I told her about the war. Not all of it, and not in order. The way you tell things when you're not trying to tell them. Just letting pieces come out when they have to. She listened without comment, mostly. Once, when I was describing something that had happened at the crater, she went still in a way that told me she knew what the crater was, and had a reason for knowing. I stopped talking. She said, Samuel's brother survived it. He said afterward that it was the worst thing he ever saw in his life. He said the men trapped in the pit were screaming for a long time. I said they were. She said, were you there? I said I was, but not in the pit. She said, I know which side that means. I said, yes. She was quiet a while. Then she said, not going to ask you to be sorry for things you did in a war. I think that's a useless thing to ask. I said, that's generous, she said. It's not generous. It's practical. Sorry doesn't change the crater. I'd rather know who you are now. On the fourth evening it rained. A cold, driving rain that came in from the northwest and made the plank roof tick and the fire necessary. We sat on opposite sides of the stove, me on the floor with my back against the wall, her on the edge of the bed. And she read from the Bible while I cleaned the Henry. Not preaching, just reading, quietly to herself, the way a person does who has been alone enough that they've given up worrying about what it looks like. I finished cleaning the rifle. I set it aside. I had nothing to do with my hands, which was uncomfortable, chirwalt, and after a while I got out my haversack and repaired the broken shoulder strap with a piece of cord I'd found in the outbuilding. I'd been meaning to fix that strap for 8 months. At some point she stopped reading and watched me work on the strap. She said, good with your hands, I said. I've had to be, she said. Most men your age who have skills have someone to use them for, I said. I had once. She waited, I said. I was promised to a girl in Caldwell County before the war. She died in '62, typhoid. I got the letter at winter quarters outside Fredericksburg. She said, I'm sorry, I said. I went on. She said, that's what people do, I said. Sometimes that's the best you can manage. She put a strip of cloth in the Bible to mark her place and closed it and set it on the crate. She looked at me for a moment with that still look. She said, Elias, why are you still here? I said, the foot. She said, your foot is better. You've been walking on it without the staff since yesterday, I said. I know, she said. So why? I looked at the strap in my hands, looked at the stove, at her. I said, because I have not been anywhere for a long time that felt like it mattered what I did with myself. And this place feels that way. She was quiet for a while. The rain ticked on the roof. She said, that's an honest thing to say. I said, you told me you preferred that. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She said, you know this can't be simple. I said, I know. She said, you know what people will say. Not just out here, everywhere. I said, I know that too. She said, and I said, I've got a scar on my face that most people see before they see anything else. I've been a target for various things since the war. I'm acquainted with what people saying things feels like, and I'm less concerned with it than I used to be. She looked at me for a long moment. She said, you'd stay. It wasn't quite a question, I said. If you'd have me, I know I haven't earned that. I'd need to earn it, she said. Yes, you would, I said. I understand, she said. I don't know if I can trust you. I want to be plain about that. I said, that's fair, she said. Trust is something I had, and then it was broken in ways that don't repair cleanly. And I have built things here on the understanding that I do not need to extend it to anyone who hasn't proved themselves to me over time. And time is the only thing that proves it, I said. I understand all of that, she said. Do you? I said, yes, you don't have to offer me anything. Not here asking for something. I'm just telling you that I'd like the chance to show you who I am over time, if you're willing to find out. The rain came harder for a moment. The fire shifted. A log settled, she said. I will think on it, I said. That's all I'm asking, she said. To sleep, Elias. I lay back on the bedroll and put my arm over my eyes. I don't know how long it was before I slept. The rain went on for hours. I lay there in the dark and the sound of it. And somewhere in the middle of that I understood. In a way, I hadn't understood anything in a long time, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not comfortable, not safe, not easy, but right. In the morning, she was up before me, as she always was, and she had coffee going. She had a small amount of real coffee, real ground coffee, and she rationed it carefully. And when I sat up, she handed me a cup. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "The fence on the south side of the tobacco barn needs new posts in 2 places. The old ones have gone soft from water getting in at the base," I said. "Can fix that," she said. "I know you can. That's why I'm telling you." She sat down with her own cup, and we drank the coffee. After a while, she said, "Samuel built the barn. He spent 2 months on it." I said, "It's a good barn," she said. "It is. He was thorough," I said. "I'll be careful with it." She said, "I know you will. I can tell how you work." That was all. We drank the coffee. The morning light came through the east window the way she'd planned it to come. I went out and fixed the fence posts. It took most of the day. The ground was still wet from the rain, and the post holes wanted to cave at the edges until the clay stiffened, and I had to work them in stages. Got mud to my elbows. My foot ached in a manageable way. Around midday, she brought me a plate with corn pone and cold beans, and she stood for a moment watching me work, and I could feel her watching without looking up, and I didn't look up. I just kept working. She went back to the house. When I came in that evening, she was at the stove, and she looked at me and she said, "You're going to need different clothes if you're going to work this land." "Those are drover clothes," I said. "I know. I'll manage until I can get to the feed store," she said. "There are some things in the chest. Samuel's. They may not fit exactly." I stopped moving. She said, "Don't read too much into it. Clothes are practical," I said. "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Della." I said, "What?" She said, "You can call me Della. You've been here almost a week." "Ma'am is something else," I said. "Della." She turned back to the stove. I did not earn her trust in a week, or a month, or even by winter. She'd been honest about that, and I'd been serious about understanding it, and the understanding was tested in the ways that real things get tested, which is daily and in small increments. What I did in those months was work. Split fence rails until I had the south field fenced proper. I put up a second small outbuilding for tools and dried goods, better sited than the first one, and with a tighter roof. I got the tobacco planted in the spring. She knew how, and I followed her lead, which was not difficult, because following her lead was generally the right decision. And I learned more about growing tobacco in those first months than I had known about anything in my life. I did not press her. I did not to make things into something they weren't yet. I slept in the outbuilding through the winter. She made sure there was insulation in it before the cold came. She didn't say anything about it, just showed up one day with hay bales and indicated where they should go. And I ate at her table, and we talked in the evenings, and I learned who she was, the way you learn things that matter, which is slowly from the side, without grabbing. There were men in the settlement who had problems with the arrangement. 2 of them came out one afternoon in February to make those problems known. I was at the fence line, and Della was in the house, and I walked over to where they'd stopped on the road. I didn't say much. I stood there with the Henry on my arm, not raised, just there, and I listened to what they had to say. It was various things about what kind of man I was, and what kind of woman she was, and what the county thought about the situation. When they were done, I said, "This is her land. I work it. What happens on it is between us and nobody else." One of them said, "You're a disgrace to your people," I said. "I've been called worse," he said. "You know what happens to white men who go native with colored women." I said, "I know what you think happens. I don't pay much attention to what you think." They left. I went back to the fence. My hands were shaking a little, but that was cold more than anything else. I worked another 2 hours before I went in. Della asked me what they wanted. I told her. She listened without expression. When I was done, she said, "I should have been out there." I said, "I had it," she said. "I know you did. I should have been out there anyway. It's my land, and I'm not hiding in my house." I said, "I know. Next time," she said. Next time. That was how it was. We were a unit that way before we were anything else, which is probably the right order for things that last. Spring came slowly, and then all at once, the way Kansas spring does, and the tobacco went in. And by April, the fields were beginning to show. And there was a morning, a clear morning, cold still, but with the sun in it. When I was out in the field, and I looked up, and she was standing at the edge of it watching the plants, and there was something in the way she stood that I hadn't seen before. Or maybe I'd seen it and hadn't understood it. A kind of ease, relaxation. She was always watchful, always ready. That didn't go away and I didn't expect it to. But a settled quality, a weight-borne evenly quality, like a woman who has put something down that she'd been carrying alone. I didn't say anything about it. I went back to work. That evening, she said over supper, "The South Field's going to be better than last year." The new posts made a difference. The deer were getting through the old fence, I said. I thought they might be. "The tracks in the mud last fall," she said. "You noticed that," I said. "I notice most things." "I don't always say them," she said. "No, you don't." She looked at me across the table. She had the lamp behind her right shoulder, and the light came around her face in a way that caught the lines of it. The strong jaw, the set of her mouth, the eyes that had never been entirely readable to me, and that I had given up trying to read, because the best version of knowing Della Marsh was learning to trust that what she did would tell you what you needed to know. She said, "You're a good man, Elias." I didn't say anything, she said. "I've been watching you since October. I've been waiting for you to show me the wrong thing and you haven't." "That's not nothing," I said. "I've wanted to stay." "That helps," she said. "What are you staying for?" I said. "You, the land." "A reason," she said. "You had reasons before," I said. "Not like this, not in a long time." She was quiet. Then she said, "Come here." I got up and walked around the table. She stood up. She was nearly as tall as me, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at me that first night. In the crack of the door, the lamp held up. Deciding. This time, what she was deciding was different. She put her hand against the side of my face, against the scar. Not around it, avoiding it, flat against it, the full warmth of her palm. She said, "I see you, you understand me, I see who you are. Been seeing it a long time." I put my hand over hers, that was all, that was the whole of it. Two people standing in lamplight in a small, clean house that had been built by her hands, and made better by mine. And her hand on the ruined side of my face, and everything that had been nothing for a long time becoming, finally, something. There is more to tell, and most of it is long and ordinary, and I would not trade a day of it. We were married in the settlement church in June of 1868, by a minister who was a freedman himself, and who said the words straight and without qualification. And there were 4 people in attendance. Her cousin and her cousin's husband who'd come the 12 miles, and the tavern keeper who surprised me by showing up, and a neighboring woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who had been Della's closest neighbor, and had never once, in all the months I'd been at the farm, looked at me with anything other than mild suspicion, but who came to the wedding and brought a jar of preserved peaches and said nothing more, or, less than that, she wished us well. I have thought about why she came. I think she came because she had watched me work, and women who have built things themselves recognize the honest application of labor. I might be wrong about that, but it's what I think. The men who'd come to the farm that February night, and the 8 with the torches from October, none of them came back in any formal way. One of them, the heavy-set man on the gray horse I saw at the feed store in Milo Creek in the following spring, he saw me. He looked at the scar and at my face, and then he looked away and bought his feed and left. That was the end of that. The tobacco was good that year, and better the year after. We added a 3rd field, and I learned to cure it right. Della had been doing alone the 2 years before, and which went faster and better with 2. We saved what we needed and banked what we could, and in 1870 we added 2 rooms to the house. Proper plank rooms, framed square, with a window in each, and Della designed them herself, by eye, on a Sunday morning with a stick in the dirt of the yard, and every measurement came out right. We had a son in 1869, born in February, in the room where I'd slept on the floor that first winter. He had her eyes exactly. We named him Samuel, after her first husband, which was her wish and which I thought was right. He learned to walk in the tobacco fields. He learned to ride on a mare we bought in 1871, a bay who was too old to be of much use for heavy work, but who had the patience for a child, and who he named Bucket for a reason he never fully explained. He grew up knowing both sides of himself without apology, which I think is the best thing a child can know, and which we decided early was the only way we intended to raise him. I am old now, or old enough. The scar is still there, it doesn't go away. A thing like that. But I've worn it long enough that it is just part of my face now, part of what I look like. And Della has put her hand against it so many times in so many kinds of light that the gesture is as natural to me as breathing. There is a morning thing she does, still. She gets up before me and makes coffee, and by the time I come out, she is standing at the east window with cup, looking at the fields. She stands the same way she stood that spring morning in 1868, the one I described, the weight-borne evenly way. And I come out and stand beside her, and we look at what we've built. It is a good place. It was a good place when she built it, and it is a better one now, and it is ours. I think about that October night sometimes. What would have happened if I'd gone back to sleep? Probably nothing good. Men who go back to sleep when something wrong is happening outside usually find the wrong thing finds its way to them anyway, sooner or later in some form. But mostly what I think about is the door opening, the lamp, the way she looked at me in the crack of it. Not frightened, not grateful, not any of the things I might have expected, just deciding. The deliberate feet on the plank floor, moving quick. A woman who had already made up her mind. She told me, years later, why she opened that door. She said, "I was tired of doing everything alone." "And you didn't sound like a man who was going to make me," I said. "I hope I haven't," she said. "You haven't." We were sitting on the step outside the front door when she told me that. It was evening, warm, and Samuel was somewhere in the near field, and the tobacco was in. And the day was the kind of day that doesn't ask anything of you. She leaned against my shoulder and I put my arm around her, and we sat there watching the light go. She said, "Not then, but some other time. Some other evening." I've lost the exact one, but I remember the words. "You've made yourself my home, Elias," I said. "I know. I'm glad you let me," she said. "You've been worth letting." The light was going out over the field. I held on. That's all. That's the whole of it. The rest is ordinary. And ordinary, when it's yours, is the best thing there is.